Acts chapter 2, through verse 28. Last time I talked about God's deliberate plan. This was his plan from long before Jesus was born. Well, the plan is simple, that salvation would be for all people, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their race, regardless of their location, all people. And he finishes this quotation from the book of Acts in verse 28 by saying, "You have made known to me the paths of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence." Well, I think the path for us is clear. And Peter is making the path very clear in his sermon. And we'll move forward in it to see more about that path. But think about this. The joy that we ought to feel realizing there was a point in time where no Gentile, almost no Gentile, was included in God's redeemed or family, or however you want to phrase it. And now we're dulled to it because we're so accustomed to the fact that we are included. This is one of the great joys to me of the gospel, is that it is inclusive. Judaism was exclusive, Jews only. Now, a Gentile could convert, proselytize, or proselyte themselves, rather, through a very complex, and if you're an adult male, a very painful series of, religious acts, including circumcision, which ought to give a man of any, even a teenager and older, the idea of being circumcised as a man ought to give you the heebie-jeebies. I'm just telling you. Well, the point of the gospel and the point of Peter's message, there's 2 points in Peter's message. You, as Peter speaks to the Jews gathered in Jerusalem for the day of Pentecost, you murdered the Messiah. And the second, still, God is desiring to forgive you and include you in his family. All right, moving on, verse 29, fellow Israelites. That's a big phrase because you got to keep Acts chapter 2 in its full context, or as full as we can. These were not just random people. These were practicing, God-fearing Jews from all over the world. Fellow Israelites, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day. If you go to Israel, you can still see his tomb. But he was a prophet and knew that God had promised him on oath that he would place one of his descendants on his throne. The question I have is, did David know this would be, about 1,000 years later? Or that it would be the Messiah? I don't know. But he did know that God had promised him on oath. If God makes a promise, he doesn't need an oath. But in this case, he gave an oath, not because he needed that to make him stick to his promise. David needed the oath, not God. I wonder if there's something in that for us. Well, we'll keep going. Verse 31, seeing what was to come, He spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah. Okay, now, a little more light on what David would have known. I also wonder, I think it's possible that David came to understand God was, through him, prophesying the coming of the Messiah and the resurrection of the Messiah. Did he know more than that? Gosh, I don't know. And it's almost a moot point. Seeing what was to come, he spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah, that he was not abandoned to the realm of the dead, nor did his body see decay. Now, I look at that, you probably look at that and go, well, yeah, that's the point of the resurrection. These were Jews. After Jesus' death and burial and resurrection, but 500 people had seen Jesus in his resurrected form, according to Peter and Luke, rather. But there was a lot more than 500 people there. These people, there were stories of resurrection. Most recently, for them, there was the story of Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. But in the Old Testament, there were also resurrections. Elijah and Elisha resurrected. There's a very interesting story of a resurrection by accident. Men were carrying Elisha's bones or dead body, to be buried in a tomb. Philistine raiders, they heard them coming at them. They threw the body, and the verbiage is literally threw the body into a cave, which turns out was a tomb. It touched the body of a dead person. We don't know how long they had been dead, but they were dead, unquestionably. It touched that body, and they came back to life and came out of the cave. Can you imagine? If the fear of the Philistines wasn't enough, think about what these guys would have felt when over their shoulder they heard somebody saying, "Hey, what's up?" Resurrection was not a brand new theme, but the resurrection of Jesus the Messiah was a brand new theme to these Jews, although, David had prophesied it. He was not abandoned to the realm of the dead, nor did his body see decay. Verse 32, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. Now, there is no question left. Who are we talking about here? We're talking about Jesus. Most of them would have known, some firsthand, the others by secondhand knowledge, that Jesus was who Peter and the other apostles and the other 119 or so folks had followed and proclaimed. Okay, we, Peter says, are witnesses of it. We're not telling you what we've heard. We're telling you what we saw and experienced. Verse 33, exalted to the right hand of God, he has received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit and has poured out what you now see and hear. All right, it's as though Peter is saying, I think you need to know the process. You killed Jesus. You buried him. God raised him from the dead and exalted him to the Father's right hand. And Jesus, and this is a very interesting play of words, received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit. And that's a hard one for me to parse, because you've got the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, three in one. So I can't explain it to myself, let alone to anybody else, how it is that Jesus and the Holy Spirit and the Father are all equal, but there seems to be a discrete interaction between the three. That the Father gave, because Jesus, the Son, received the Holy Spirit and poured him out on these 120 at the day of Pentecost. Well, I can't explain it very well. I can just say the point is, it was God's desire, and the appointed time had come, and through Jesus, the Holy Spirit was poured out on his followers. And on the day of Pentecost, it was poured out in dramatic fashion. This was not what was that? This was some, holy smokes, what was that? Exalted to the right hand of God. Let's pause there for a minute. Paul, in the book of Philippians, writes that Jesus is the name above all names, that every knee will bow and confess that Jesus is Lord, that he will be exalted. And here, on heaven's side, he already was exalted. There are ways in which Jesus was exalted by God during his earthly life. At least 2 times that we know of, a voice from heaven said, "This is my much loved, dearly loved Son. Listen to him." And after his baptism, he said, "This is my dearly loved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Important point here. Jesus had done nothing publicly that any of the gospel writers recorded in the way of miracles or teachings or signs and wonders. And God said he was well pleased. Little bunny trail. What pleases God about me and you is not so much our acts. It is what is in our hearts. And what is in my heart will get out into my behavior. Okay. Exalted to the right hand of God. He received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit and has poured out what you now see and hear. Yes, this really is happening. And it's not happening by our effort. It's not happening by some means within us. I think it may be stretching it a little, but I think it's within reason to interpret this as it's not because of anything we've done. This work is all from the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit was poured out on us, and from that, what you see and hear has come to pass. This for us is deeply theological. For the first century Jew, I believe it would have been quite confusing. They believed in, depending on their particular theological bent, they believed in the Spirit of God, because in the Old Testament it is talked about. They certainly believed in God as the Father. Now, some of them, we're going to find out, began to believe in Jesus as the one and only begotten Son of God. Well, there's more in it. Duh. Come back to it next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.